Everybody, and thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to start by saying or continue what Professor Litvak said, that we need to look at Iran from a 30-60 perception. But the problem is that we see everything from our own prism. We think that everything has to do in the Israeli court context. But Iran is much bigger than that, and we need to understand Iran in the broader context in order to be able to analyze the Israeli context. And one of the issues is definitely related to the emerging relationship, deepening relationship between Iran and Russia. And it's not accidental that what we see in this picture, Khamenei and Putin, actually, these are the two leaders of this deepening of relationship that we will discuss. But we will also touch upon what Tamir said at the beginning, the fact that eventually Iran, its daily routine is managed by the president, and there are differences between the president and the prime minister, and it could be meaningful. But in principle, Khamenei and Putin run the show, and there are different limitations, though, mentioned by Professor Litvak at the beginning. We'll speak a little bit about history. We see a longer introduction from Dr. Zimt, but we will talk about history for the very simple reason that the leader of Iran sees himself as a great historian, and you cannot convince him with regards to his ability. So this is very, very significant. We'll speak about the deepening of the relationship definitely after Ukraine war, and the leader of Iran cannot let go of the past, of history. The sentence that was mentioned by Professor Litvak, no West, no East. I think that this is a quote that you can see at the entrance of the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is what leading Khamenei perception. We need to take it into account, because when we speak about the relationship between the countries, we should remember this glass ceiling that goes back to the past and how Khamenei sees the history of the relationship between the two states. We'll speak, of course, about the present ever since 2015 on, from the unprecedented aid given by Russian and the visit of Qasem in the state. We'll speak about it. This is how the relationship got tighter at the operational level, and we'll speak about the Ukraine angle that brought about the breaking through all the different networks and concerns, building concerns about in Israel regarding the deepening of the relationship between Russia and Iran. We'll speak a little bit about the future. We'll speak of
כמבט צופה פני עתיד, וכמובן ננסה לדבר קצת על הסיפור הישראלי, מכיוון שבסופו של דבר ישראל, ודרך אגב גם אנחנו רואים את זה במכון.
Then we see it at the INSS. We've seen recent publications about the relationships, and we think that we have to reconsider and rethink about the relationship between Israel and Russia, and of course it affects the situation with Ukraine, etc. Because we think that we cannot ignore the deep relationship between Iran and Russia. A little bit about the past, which will lead us to the present and future. As we said, Khamenei is really into history, so he's very suspicious. He's suspicious towards everybody. He's not willing to rely on nobody, so he doesn't want to put all the eggs in one bag. So it actually affects the Iranian nuclear program, which is relied on local Iranian know-how. This perception, we have no one to rely on. Resistance, it goes back to the Russians as well. We can collaborate with many different countries, China, Russia, etc., but we should never rely on them. So that's why we need to remember it when we speak about the emerging, deepening relationship between the different countries, and it goes back to historical events that I'm sure that Dr. Zimt will discuss, starting with what happened in the Qajari dynasty and the invasion of the Russians to North Iran. All of these things go go back to the concern of Iranian leaders to rely on superpowers, and in particular superpowers with which they have a complex relationship. Although Iran tends to collaborate with others in order to fulfill its goals, but there are gaps, and gaps that led after the revolution, during the first years of revolution, to a very tense relationship between the parties. It's not as if right after the revolution we saw the states tightening their relationship. They needed to overcome years of suspicion, and Iran under the Shah collaborated with the US, and of course there were US bases vis-a-vis USSR, and this is something that is very hard for the Russians to let go. So how do we see the phases or the relationship tightening? So first of all, in the 80s, they were characterized by wars, and war in Afghanistan, and we have to say that the Iranians helped. There are many Shia factors in Afghanistan, and the Iranians brought them weapons that were used for harming Russian soldiers. But in the Iran-Iraq war, we saw the Russians supporting Saddam Hussein. So the end of these wars, and of course the collapse of the USSR. They don't have a border. There is a geographical barrier between them. So it brought about the deepening of the relationship alongside the acute need of Iran to get more weapons. And of course, the USSR, and afterwards Russia, was the leading candidate for purchasing these systems. So in the late 80s, beginning 90s, we have witnessed the relationship getting closer and closer, but we cannot compare it to what happened after Putin became the president. We actually saw a strategic decision to deepen the relationship. There was a strategic agreement in 2001, introduction of Russian companies, and of course the F-300 deal as indication to the deepening of this relationship between the two countries. But here again, I'm not talking about the Russian, only about the, so so it's not as if Putin wanted to prioritize only relationship with Iran, but during the first term of Putin, it changed, and the peak ever since 2011 is, of course, the civil war in Syria. Why was it so meaningful? But let me explain what took place there. Bashar al-Assad, we just tend to forget it, but he was on the verge of being defeated with Hezbollah and Iranians' involvement. In 2015, the rebels were almost reached the palace, the president palace, and the Iranians needed Russian help. And Qasem Soleimani went on a unique meeting with Putin, and managed to convince the Russians to join the war and save Assad. It was manifested in two ways: with aid that they provided and by the Russians, but also there were air forces, ground forces, Wagner, Spetsnaz, and collaboration with Hezbollah and the Shia militias in Syria in order to save Bashar al-Assad. And this is something that they succeeded. And of course, we're not discussing Syria here, but Bashar al-Assad actually, with the Russian aid, managed to resume control, and this is a significant achievement for this axis. And this story, of course, led, unfortunately, it influences, it has problematic impacts. So we see the connection between Hezbollah and Russia, and of course, tightening the relationship at the operational level, not to mention the fact that the Iranians could see Russian operation, their systems, methodologies. They learned quite a lot from them. So we see this relationship being developed, and we have to say in this context that when we speak about the problems in this relationship, For example, according to Iranian perception, Russians allow Israel to continue with its policy, but eventually by the fact that things are complicated, we see this relationship being developed. But nothing prepared us to the Ukraine-Russian conflict. Russia attacked Ukraine, invaded Ukraine, and in fact, it came across strategic difficulties, and they needed to find operational solutions, significant operational solutions. And of course, Iran was a perfect candidate in terms of the unmanned aircraft. They have an advantage there. They are very cheap, these aircraft, and you don't need to train the people about how to use it. So they thought that using these aircrafts can change the battlefield and help them create more harm. But in the Iranian context, I'm not sure the Iranians really understood the price that they might pay for that. But why haven't... So first of all, according to Iranian perception, the Russian request was not related to the economic aspect. Aircrafts, and of course, they make profits out of it. But first and foremost, Iran sees itself as a superpower, especially in this region, and they thought that if the Russians ask them for help, then it must see them as equal, and they wanted this dependence, because the Iranians understand that nobody can supply aircrafts as well as they can. So eventually there is dependence there, and even more so, Iranians are not only used. We can speak about what happened at the beginning of 2000, or the negotiation about the nuclear program. Iranians understood that they serve, that actually the Russians thought that if they can play with the Iranians, they will be able to get closer to the West, and the West will pay a price. And the Iranians felt that they are being played with. And here, for the first time, they are being treated as equals. So this is how the Iranians see it, and it's more important than the economic aspect. So let me just say, when we spoke about the danger of Iranian proliferation, we're not even speaking about the economic aspect. For example, it's important to emphasize in this context the fact that today Iran sends an unmanned aircraft to Sudan. It's about their foothold in Africa. So it's not about the economic reasons. There are heavy strategic aspect, and the Iranians understood quite fast what they can gain, not only at the economic level, but also with regards to Iranians' force buildup. We have to say that this relationship, we talked about it at the beginning, Khamenei doesn't want to rely on Russia, on the superpower, but beyond that, there are other meaningful aspects that needs to be discussed, and they create a difficulty to further tightening of the relationship between the countries. First and foremost, support of Russia in UAE, all the conflicted areas in the Gulf. And why is it so meaningful? Because we see that at the peak of the tightening of relationship between the two countries, still Lavrov speaks about Russia's support as UAE's claims. So we have to remember that Russia has broad relationships in the Gulf areas, not only with Iran. They have good relationship with Saudi Arabia in terms of the OPEC, and there is also the relationship between UAE and Russia. So eventually this support is very, very relevant, and it's good for the Russians because when we think about their getting support from the moderate Gulf states, but they have to pay a price because the Iranians are suspicious. And of course, there is also the Caucasians element. In the Israeli context, we tend to ignore it, but the very complicated relationship between Iran and Azerbaijan, mainly the Armenian part, and the problematic connection between the two leaderships. The Iranians don't like it because they want to tighten this relationship. They want to put pressure on Azerbaijan because it has a very good relationship with Israel. And here, the Iranian-Russian connection is not perceived well in Tehran. Of course, there is the Syrian aspect. Israel continues with the campaign between wars policy, and the Iranians don't like it. They are afraid of the A300, and the Iranians actually think that it's because it took a long time, and Israel and Iranians blame Israel for that. There is also the Chinese element. The Chinese actually blackmail Iran and Russia, and they want to pay less for a barrel of oil, and there is a struggle between them. So most exports of Iranian oil under American sanctions, so there are more. That market is very significant for them, and there is also the price that Iran is paying. It's not as if there was a serious incident in the context of Iranian-European context. Ambassadors were not sent home, but I think that the Iranians understand better the pay that they might pay if the relationship between Russia and the EU gets worse. Why is it so significant? It was less significant at the time of Raisi, but with the new president who speaks about Iran's desire to deepen relationship with European countries, Russia can be an obstacle for them. So what does Iran want to gain as a result of the Russian collaboration? Help with cyber, and there is also the nuclear element. Will Russia change its mind with regards to its willingness to allow Iran to have nuclear weapon and maybe even help it? That's an issue, according to Israeli perspective, which is a great concern for Israelis. And these both countries have manage influence campaigns. We see it on both the Russian and Iranian side, so they can develop mutual tools. We can see support in international institutions. The Iran invest a lot in the Russians. They hope that we'll support them in case the Iranians retaliate for Hania's assassination. And deepening of the economic aid, including different economic projects, railroads from India through Iran. Both countries experience sanctions, and the Russians learn from the Iranian how to overcome sanctions. Western munition find its way from Russia to Iran, and the Iranians do reverse engineering, and they do it quite well. And of course, collaboration with regards to space. They launched the Iranian satellite with the help of the Russians. We see deepening collaboration there. There is also conventional force build-up. So will we see the Russians help the Iranians? So there are also export of weapons. These two countries have a joint plant to manufacture unmanned aircraft, and money they gain from the sale of the munition, and of course being accepted into international institutions. So there are major questions about the relationship, and let's talk a little bit about the future. Still, there are many question marks regarding Sukhoi 35. Why hasn't it reached there yet? The Iranians are really interested in it because it will change the entire reality. They have all their aircraft, and now they can get an advanced generation of aircraft. So how come? What causes the delays? Is it a strategic delay? Is it related to the Russian policy vis-a-vis the other Gulf states, UAE and Saudi Arabia? We don't know. There is also the gas agreement that is being postponed, and Tamir mentioned Pezeshkian. It's not as if it's a president who is charismatic and everybody's is influenced by it. He just found himself after the death of Raisi as stepping in, but he's not like Rouhani in terms of his experience, background, and his ability to recruit the Iranian system, but still, it's a president who is interested to tighten the relationship with the West to reach nuclear agreement that will lift the sanctions, and it clashes with the Russian element here because Raisi wanted to deepen the relationship with Russia because he thought that the future, and it's also related to the next panel, he thought that the future of Iran is in the East and not in the West. And let me mention shortly the other issues. There is also the question of the glass ceiling with regards to the relationship between the countries, nuclear in Iran, etc. After Khamenei, we don't know how the system will be designed, but since he was a very dominant person, there's a question mark here. We cannot ignore the Russian aid to the Iranian proxy, for example, Houthis, and here we need to follow up on that. Will we see joint activity in other continents? For example, Africa, we saw that they took advantage of the coup in Niger in order to benefit from it, and here again we need to check whether there will be collaboration there. And the last question that I think that is also related, it's the Israeli policy. Should Israel maintain its policy as is, or maybe we need to think about changing our policy with regards to Ukraine? But we must say that recent events teach us about the benefits, disadvantages, and advantages. But the head of the National Security Council from Russia came to a visit, and when the Iranian asked the Russians military aid to help them, to help their defense, so on the one hand, we see that how this collaboration leads to additional requests from the Russians, which might harm Israeli interests. But on the other hand, unless based on reports in the media, we saw that the messages that were given to the Iranian leadership was the fact that Putin wanted to calm the situation in a way that civilians' targets will not be harmed. So deepening of this relationship in Israeli context might actually lead us to use Russia as a pipe to convey messages to the Iranian leadership. But on the other hand, we understand quite well that Iran is part of this collaboration between Russia and Iran, allows Israel to understand better the Iranian problem. Thank you for listening.